There are two strains in journalism: just present the facts and let the public decide, or take a stand and advocate for what you believe is right. But sometimes it's hard to figure out which direction a newspaper is coming from.
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was found guilty on all charges.
Guilt in the Boston Marathon bombing trial was pretty much a foregone conclusion.
This trial is now headed into a second and key phase, the death penalty phase.
The real question has always been whether Dzhokhar Tsarnaev should be sentenced to death or life in prison. But some, including WBZ Radio's Dan Ray, say the Boston Globe has already decided.
And for the last couple of weeks, the Boston Globe, by virtue of its story placement, has basically campaigned for life in prison for the Boston bomber, which is their absolute right to do editorially.
Ray goes on to cite this front-page letter from the parents of Martin Richard, arguing against the death penalty. He also cites the prominent placement the Globe gave its own poll, suggesting broad public opposition to the death penalty.
There's an effort by the Globe clearly to influence the outcome here.
But Boston Globe editor Brian McGrory denies any agenda, telling Beat the Press that they're doing what any good paper does. We report the facts. He says the poll was newsworthy because it shows public support for capital punishment has declined during the trial. And he adds the letter from Martin Richards' parents would have gotten the exact same placement if they had called for the death penalty. Actually, that was a really interesting point of information. I was curious to know. Brian McGrory and the rest of the Boston Globe had no idea what the Richards were going to say. I'm not sure whether the Globe reached out to them or they reached out to the Boston Globe. It really doesn't matter. But when they saw it, that was when the first time they had an inkling of how the Richards were going to come down. You know, in many ways, the Boston Globe reflects, though, the attitude, the sense, the feeling of most of Massachusetts. What it doesn't necessarily represent is the jurors in that courtroom, because they all had to swear that they could vote for the death penalty. So the fact that, and by the way, as you all know, the jury is supposedly, allegedly not reading or seeing any of the coverage of this. So Dan Ray makes the point, oh, well, they're trying to influence the outcome. Well, if the jurors are honoring their sworn commitment here, they're not seeing any of that coverage.
Yeah, I mean, I think the world of Dan Ray, but I think he's just wrong about that, because my experience has been, and I think probably all of us who've covered trials would agree, is that jurors take their obligations really seriously.
You wouldn't sneak a peek, Dan?
Well, they'd never let me serve on the jury.
I know, yeah.
But, I mean, I think that jurors in general take this very seriously, and I'll bet they don't know that the Richards came out against the death penalty in the dramatic way that they did. You know, I mean, I think that if the Globe really wanted to crusade against the death penalty, I can think of a number of stories that they could splash on page one that they haven't, starting with the fact that the feds decided to bring a death penalty case in a state that doesn't have the death penalty, in contradiction of the laws of Massachusetts, and based on these polls against the wishes of the residents of this state.
We have done that before, Gary Lee Sampson.
Well, if the Globe had really wanted to inoculate itself against Dan Ray's criticism, they could have given prominent placement to a feature story on the Norden family, another victimized family, to the woman with two sons who both lost a limb, who are staunchly for the death penalty.
They did do that as a follow-up story. It just wasn't in the same placement.
Yeah, not quite the same kind of prominent placement. That's a minor sin of omission, I guess. But I have no problem with what they did. I mean, Dan and I met when we worked together at the Boston Phoenix, the Bible of advocacy journalism in its day in this town. So I have nothing against that at all. And the notion that, oh, gee, maybe a juror might violate their instructions and look at it and be influenced, I don't think the media can function with that as a restraint. We have to do what we do and let the jurors and the criminal justice system take care of its own business.
It's also ridiculous because there's an audience that's broader than this jury. I mean, the Boston Globe does not just serve the people that are deliberating in that courtroom. The broader point, though, is that this is just the logical progression of coverage. This case has reached the sentencing phase. There's only two things that are going to happen after this point. And so the Globe, I think, is doing what any newspaper would do, which is essentially weighing what are people thinking. They've looked at what a lot of the survivors and victims have said, and a lot of them are coming out and saying, we don't think that the death penalty is right. I think that's just following the story. There's nothing wrong with that.
So I don't want to put words in Dan Ray's mouth, but if I'm understanding him, it wasn't that he said a newspaper can't cover it. He was saying that editorially, great, But if it's all throughout your coverage, that's a separate deal from the editorial page. And if the preponderance of that is that everybody is against the death penalty, then what message are you sending? Or did you decide that's the message you wanted to do by selecting these people? So I read very carefully through, which is a legitimate criticism, but I read very carefully through the stories. And some of them, how would they know how the people felt? So, you mentioned
Like the one on
family that
ADX in Colorado?
Right, that. And then also they did a roundup of sort of a number of people who had been affected, and they had different viewpoints. So you could argue that if you're going to have a very prominent placement editorially for some, as it turns out, they were opposed to it, you might want to, maybe you split the page and have somebody editorially to have another letter that says, well, here's why he's got to go. And then be very, very careful, maybe even bend over backwards that your coverage does not seem to be a preponderance of all people who. But we are in Massachusetts,
and also,
so
the Richard
the
family was is kind of the face of the tragedy. I mean, I recognize
really
her,
are.
and I think the prominence was because it was them.
Right.
So
what they had to say was news, no matter what. I
Well, of
agree,
course.
but look, if Brian McGrory thought that the Globe's coverage was going to sway public opinion of the jury, and I don't think he did, then he was naive. Because the fact is, and you learn this from covering politics, this is one of those issues where you're either for it or you're against it.
It's like
and
abortion.
It's very difficult to move people. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.